So I want to welcome everyone to NextFab and our third edition of the winter residency. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that NextFab and the Museum for Art and Wood are located on the land of the Lenni Lenape Nation. We honor those who steward these unceded lands, past, present, and future. And if you'd like to learn more about the Lenni Lenape, I will be dropping in some links in the chat as soon as I am off the mic. So again, thank you for joining us for the Winter Residency Gallery Talk with this year's 2023 fellow Michael Ferrin. As I mentioned, this is the third edition of the residency in partnership between the Museum for Art and Wood and NextFab. Believe it or not, 2020 was the inaugural launch of this special residency that not only offers access to amazing equipment and workspace, but also supports environmental stewardship by requiring reclaimed wood to comprise at least 50% of the fellows' work during the residency. I'd like to give a special thank you to our winter residency jurors, Kelly McGovern, Lila Cartier, Executive Director of Craft Now Philadelphia, Nishay Jones, artist, scholar, and curator, and Jennifer Navamilikan, the museum's Executive Director and Chief Curator. I'd like to introduce the 2023 fellow, Michael Ferrin. He is an artist from Southwest Philadelphia, working primarily in wood. He employs his training as a furniture maker and his education as an artist to explore the connection between spirituality and craft, relationship to place, and how power shapes and is reinforced by narratives about craft history. Michael's interests range from the influence of Muslim arts on European medieval design vocabulary to the visual landscape of Philadelphia's public transit infrastructure. He has recently been incorporating Persian khatam marquetry into his work. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Michael.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Oh, hold on. There we go. Okay. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you, Katie, for that introduction. So I'll be talking about the work that I did over the past 2 months for the residency. And Katie already gave you my quick biography. So I'll skip this one. So I guess the next, now I'll talk a little bit about, a little more about the themes in my work in general. One of the main themes that I explore in my work is Islamic spirituality. As a Muslim, I'm interested in the symbolism of geometry in Islamic art. And I'm also interested in art as a meditative practice, both in terms of the finished product and the process of making. I'm interested in connection to place. As a lifelong Philadelphian, I'm interested in the ways that our shared imagery creates a sense of community that's specific to a place and kind of resonates with the residents of that place, and of course, specifically Philadelphia. But I'm also very interested in finding connections between communities and looking at themes that cross cultural borders as a way to broaden our circle of compassion, to borrow a phrase from Omid Safi. And finally, historical narratives. Also as a Philadelphian, I feel a commitment to supporting the people in my community and their struggles. And I think in particular, living in a time now when The power structures that support white supremacy are really kind of becoming more entrenched as a response to protest movements. I think that's especially important. And so in my work, I'm interested in looking at how narratives of the history of craft are shaped by and shape and reinforce power, and looking for ways to challenge those narratives and offer alternatives. So here is some of my previous work. This piece is titled Pennsylvania Spice Cabinet, and it was made when I was a student at the College of the Redwoods in California. And so this is an example of the connection to place. So this piece was inspired by the design of shaker spice cabinets, which are a common form, or were a common form in the Northeast, in Pennsylvania and New York particularly. And most of the wood that I used for this project was either from Pennsylvania or spent a significant part of its life in Pennsylvania. And it was all either reclaimed or sustainably harvested. So the black walnut that was used for the carcass of the case and the frame of the doors came from a lumber mill in New Jersey that went out of business, and the tree was cut locally. The southern yellow pine in the door panels came from the joists of a factory building in North Philadelphia. The red oak that formed the fronts of the drawer boxes, which you can see in the middle photo and the right-hand photo, came from Blue Rooster Farm in central Pennsylvania, where the landowners were doing a forest restoration project and selectively cutting trees and milling them. And the redwood that formed the sides of the drawers that you can see in the right-hand photo came from water tanks that were built at a shop in North Philadelphia. These two pieces are more recent work. They're both copies of medieval French benches that are in the collections of the Cloisters Museum in New York City. And I've recently gotten interested in making historical reproductions as a way to understand the thought process of the original makers, and kind of trying to figure out things like why they chose to use the joinery that they used, which particularly in these medieval pieces of furniture seems kind of unusual if you're used to looking at 18th and 19th century European furniture, which is what most people doing reproduction work are making. And the bench on the right is one that I'm currently working on, and that piece gets into my interest in historic narratives about craft. So there's a kind of a persistent myth of medieval Europe as sort of a white Christian island was separate from the rest of the world. And that's a myth that kind of reinforces white supremacy and ideas about white exceptionalism. And so the version of the bench that I'm making, the original has carving on both of the legs. And in my version, I'm doing medieval European style carving on one of the legs, and I'll be doing khatam inlaid on the other leg as a way of talking about how Islamic art and architecture influenced European design. And in particular on this piece, this is a detail that is present in the original as well, but there's this OG arch cut out at the bottom of the legs. And that style of arch originates in Iran and entered Europe through Muslim Spain and the Levant, and then became like very common in European architecture. This piece was part of my senior thesis project at the University of Pennsylvania, during which I spent 3 months collecting plastic bottles from vacant lots and on the streets in Philadelphia, and exploring ways of manipulating them and making other things out of them. And so this was one iteration that came out of that project. So the drawing on the left is of some ZELLIJ tiles from a mosque in Tunisia, and ZELLIJ is the style of tile work that's commonly done in North Africa. And then on the right-hand side, I've recreated the pattern using labels from soda bottles that I collected. And so this was sort of a transition piece for me. It was sort of when I was first getting interested in Islamic geometric design, and I was exploring ways of combining it with local imagery and themes. Ultimately, I wanted to find ways of incorporating my woodworking into that process. And so eventually I discovered khatam and became kind of obsessed with it. And in khatam, I found a way to combine my interest in woodworking and Islamic art and spirituality. So what is khatam? It's a surface decoration that is primarily practiced in Iran, but also in other parts of the Middle East. The basic unit is a equilateral triangle, and a variety of materials are used, like different species of wood and bone, and often the bone is dyed bright colors, and then also metals, especially brass and sometimes silver and gold are used. And the triangles are glued together in bundles and then cut into veneers. And one of the things that I learned during my research for the residency was I kind of went into it thinking that khatam was a kind of marquetry. And there was a particular paper that I read by an Iranian scholar or art historian who made a case that it's not synonymous with marquetry or inlay, even though in English writing about it, it's often translated that way. But it's a distinct art that's related to both marquetry and inlay, but kind of shouldn't be talked about as if it's the same thing. So I got interested in making khatam, and this is a piece that I made prior to the residency. This was the first object, kind of finished object that I made using khatam, and I was really excited about learning about this process. But there were some things about this box that I wasn't completely happy with that I kind of wanted to build on. So like a few specific things were the size of the triangles. It's sort of hard to see the scale in this photograph, but the triangles that I use here are quite a bit bigger than what is commonly used in khatam making. And then also the variety of materials I've only used in this piece, only used two different materials. So it's mahogany and maple. And khatam generally incorporates a lot more materials to get like a broader color palette. And so the goals that I had going into the residency were, first of all, just to get better at making khatam, to learn more about the process and kind of refine it refine the way that I was doing it, and kind of get better at doing it more efficiently and accurately. I was also interested in doing more research into the history and culture of khatam making. I also, before the residency, had started communicating with one khatam maker in Iran. And unfortunately, we lost touch when the current protests started and his internet was shut off. But I was interested in using the residency as an opportunity to reach out to other makers and build relationships with them. And then lastly, in making a finished piece for the residency, I wanted to find a way to connect it to local themes. And I was particularly interested in SEPTA and the relationship between Philadelphia's Muslim community and public transportation. So the methods that I used during the residency to try to achieve those goals, one of the first things I did at the beginning of the residency was I spent a day riding the Broad Street line. So I got on at City Hall and rode north, and I got off at each stop and photographed the tiles in the stations, and then got on the next train and just kept going all the way to the end of the line. And so the photo on the left shows a few of the photographs that I took as part of that. And then when I got back, I started doing sketches of the tiles, and they eventually formed the basis of the design for the finished piece that I made. And then another part of my methodology was the research that I was doing. So the photo, or the image in the middle, is the cover of a book called Khatam Sazi, which means khatam making. which was written by Mohammed Satari in 1989. And I found a digital copy of this book online, but it's all in Farsi, and I don't speak Farsi. So I started kind of painstakingly translating it sentence by sentence. And it's starts off with a section on the history of khatam, and then the bulk of the book is a manual on how to make it. And then another part of the research that I was doing was talking to people both in Iran and in the US about khatam and marquetry more generally. And then the third component was actually making khatam. And the image on the right shows a bandsaw jig that I made to cut the sticks that form the kind of basic unit of khatam. In Iran, what people generally do is they have a bandsaw that's set up at a 60-degree angle to cut equilateral triangles. And rather than having to change the angle on the bandsaw every time I came to NextFab and then set it back for the next person, I built this jig so that I could just, plop the jig onto the bandsaw and then make the cuts that I needed to make. So from the research that I was doing, I got very interested in the history of khatam. And one of the things that came up in every history that I read about it is that the origins are very disputed. So there's various theories that propose China and Iran and India and Egypt as all kind of potential places that khatam originated. But this is the first example that I could find of a piece that is what would be recognized as khatam today. And there's some other pieces that are potentially predecessors to it, but the patterns and the basic shapes are slightly different. So this is a Quran stand from the 14th century that was made in Iran, and it's at the Met Museum in New York. And you can see that khatam is combined with other decorative techniques here. The primary one is the really elaborate carving on the sides, and then the khatam is sort of just a border decoration, and it's these inlaid hexagons that you see a detail of in the right-hand photograph. So after this piece, the history kind of goes through a couple of peaks and valleys where it became more popular during the Safavid era, and then there was a decline. And then in the 20th century, when a lot of art schools were established in Iran, there was another rise in interest in khatam making. Which brings us to the present. And khatam today is widely practiced in Iran, and there's a lot of national pride associated with it. So a lot of the material that I was able to find on it sort of talks a lot about how great Iranian khatam is and how it's so much better than the khatam that's made in other countries. From talking to one of the khatam makers in Iran and asking him how he learned the craft, I sort of gathered that the way a lot of people learn in Iran is that there are masters who will teach small classes and workshops, and individuals will take those classes. And I think it's the sort of art where there's sort of a high and low version of it. So a lot of people working at home will make souvenirs that they then can sell to tourists. But then there are also masters who make commissioned furniture pieces that are highly elaborate and much more precise. And then it's also historically been used in the decoration of sacred sites, such as some of the tombs of the Shia imams and the tombs of Sufi saints. So the process that I came up with, which is based on the research that I did and talking to the people in Iran and stuff, and I tried to kind of stick to their process as much as possible, but given the tools that were available to me, I had to kind of make a few slight variations. But the sort of quick version of how this works is you start by cutting these sticks of equilateral triangles that are around 18 to 24 inches long. And then you glue them together in pairs and wrap string around them to hold them while the glue dries. And then you take those diamonds that result from that and start gluing those together. And you just keep kind of building up a pattern until you get to something like the image in the middle photograph here, which is a block that's called a luz khatam, and luz means rhombus in Farsi. And then that block gets sliced across the grain on the bandsaw to form wafers that then you have to fit together. And there's a lot of kind of trimming and adjusting things to get the pattern to line up. And they get glued onto the surface of whatever object you're decorating. So that's the quick version of how the process works. And so here's the finished piece that I made. On the right hand, it is a scaled down reproduction of a subway column from the Girard station on the Broad Street line in Philadelphia. And so I generated 3 different patterns of khatam to represent the 3 colors of tiles that were used in the original subway column. And I sort of tried to kind of generally go for patterns that had colors that would sort of represent the contrast in the original tiles, but I wasn't too concerned about really like faithfully reproducing the original. I just wanted to sort of make something that was recognizable as a version of the original object. And so the themes that I was getting at with this piece, or at least trying to get at, are the historical narratives idea, coming back to that. I was thinking about how Philadelphia's Muslim community is predominantly Black and, of course, marginalized, even though Muslims in Philadelphia have and do today play a big role in the city's artistic output, in like everything from visual art to music to fashion, and like any other kind of creative endeavor. And so the idea of recreating the subway column using this technique from Islamic art was meant to be sort of a visual representation of the impact and the imprint that Muslims have left on the city. It's also gets into connection to place, which, of course, being a image from Philadelphia's public transit, that's part of it. But there's also sort of what I kind of think of subway stations as representing in Philadelphia. They kind of form like a locus of Philadelphia's culture. So there's like the underground component of a subway station that provides transport for the city's residents. And it's also a point of social connection where people will like run into old friends and make new friends and have interactions with strangers. And then the above ground part is a place where, like at the top of the steps leading down to the subway station, you'll often find sites of the street economy where people are selling incense and oils and halal soap and things of that nature. And then go to a couple of detail photos here. And so here I wanted to talk about the issue of sustainability and how this piece represents that concern. So all the wood that I used for this piece was either scraps from cabinet shops where I worked at previously, or from the trash bin here at NextFab, or from broken furniture that I found on the side of the road. So in the lighter colored pattern, the lighter wood is poplar and the darker wood is black walnut, which were both offcuts from a cabinet shop that I worked at. And then in the same goes for the pattern that's sort of a red background with white stars on it. And then the third kind of more complex pattern with the darker hexagons. The lightest color in that pattern was sycamore that came from a broken dresser that I found on the side of the road. And I took the drawers apart and they were like nice wide pieces of sycamore that were kind of perfect for this purpose. And then the reddish wood in that pattern is cherry that I found in the scrap bin here at NextFab. So I guess what I got, what sort of resulted from the residency was that I think I was able to improve on my process of making khatam and got more accurate, and was able to start doing it more efficiently than I had been previously. I made a lot of connections with other artists and craftspeople that were really informative, both in terms of the khatam making and just thinking about art and the issues that I was working with more generally. And then lastly, I went into the residency planning to do a lot of research, but once I got going, I realized that the research component kind of formed a bigger portion of it than I had anticipated. And it was, I mean, partly because it was just so fascinating that I got really kind of wrapped up in it, and really enjoyed that part of it. And so I'm planning on continuing that research. I'd like to continue. I mentioned earlier that I started translating that book out of Farsi into English, and I'd like to continue doing some of that work. And a lot of the theories that I mentioned earlier about the origins of khatam are sort of just vaguely mentioned in the English literature, which is very limited. And so I'm hoping that getting into more of the academic papers on khatam that are written in Farsi, I'll be able to find some more detailed information about those theories. And of course, I want to maintain the connections that I formed with people both in Iran and in the US, and hopefully do some collaborative work with some of those people, although in particular for work, as far as working with people in Iran, the sanctions make that sort of a big question mark. And so, and of course, making more khatam and figuring out ways to do it even more efficiently and get more accurate. And especially I want to try to get those triangles as small as possible. And the subway theme, I feel like there's a lot more room to explore that theme. So I'm going to hopefully do more of that, both in terms of making more subway columns and also looking at the rest of the visual landscape of SEPTA for other materials to work with. And to go back to the craft part of it, one of the goals that I have is so far I've only been working with wood, and in this photo on the right, which is also from that Muhammad Satari book, you can see he's showing like a variety of wood species here, and then the two kind of white ones on the top right are camel bone and ivory, which I was told by one of the people I talked to that ivory is really not used even in Iran anymore, just because the legality of using it is so questionable. But people are using artificial ivory a lot. But I'm hoping in my own future work to start learning how to work with bone and metal and incorporating those into my work. And so to close, I'd just like to thank everyone at the Museum for Art and Wood and NextFab for supporting this residency and giving me the opportunity to do this work. Sophie Courtney for being a very supportive partner while I was spending so much time doing this. And Ruhollah Kazemi, who was the craftsperson I was in communication with in Iran, who provided me with a lot of really valuable information on his process and sort of the way that khatam is viewed in Iranian culture. Daru's gallery was really generous, letting me use some images of their work in the presentation. Catherine Sullivan is a marketer that I had some really productive conversations with about the history of the kind of marquetry that they work on, and kind of history of art in general. And then Michael Hurwitz, Laura Mays, and Kayla Romberger, who were all fantastic mentors and helped me get this residency. And Beiruz Salim-Nejad at the Conservation Lab at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who was really generous with his time and spent a few hours help with me to translate some YouTube videos and provide some of his insight into Iranian culture and khatam making. And this is a quick bibliography of some of the sources that I used. And if anyone's interested, I can share that later. So thank you. And